Yeah.
Just I suppose it's slightly re-encapsulating what you've already asked, but it's I suppose how useful is it for us to look at the 30s as a model, as some kind of template for what we're going through now? I mean, I think Paul Mason, you talked about the road to Wigan Pier. You alluded to Wigan Pier, and I think that feeling that Orwell encountered such extraordinary poverty in his travels, and a sense, I suppose, not of there being a kind of language in which you would attribute blame to the state for your troubles. It seems to me that since the post-war period, we've got a feeling of who to blame or who to turn to for some form of centralised support, and that didn't really seem to exist in the 30s. It doesn't exist in Coming Up for Air. George Bowling isn't complaining about. I mean, there's a sense of self-reliance and also kind of accusation. If you don't have a job, you've just got to knuckle down and get on with it. And I don't know. I suppose I wonder whether there's a feeling here that the 30s, in a sense, perhaps provide some sort of perspective for us, that we shouldn't get too hysterical or indeed damning about the state of play, because there was almost nothing for those workers to turn to in the 30s. I don't know how this idea of the 30s being in some ways parallel to. I don't know what you think of that.
Well, my family were miners in Leigh in the 30s, and I can tell you that they never recovered from the Depression. That physically, they were thin. Emotionally, they never recovered from the experience of being unemployed. Because the problem wasn't the poverty. Actually, they were poor already. The descriptions of poverty are just unbelievable. But what it was the humiliation of being unemployed and of being at the mercy of people you couldn't pay. So, my dad would tell me that he would, grab the legs of his mother to stop her answering the door in case it was one of the people they owed money to. Because as soon as that happened, all sorts of other shit happened in the family, as you can all just imagine what it would be. So the trauma was there. And I think that the thing that kept Labour and Tory governments in power on an even keel with a shared commitment to full employment in the 50s, 60s and early 70s was that really it was inconceivable that you would want voluntarily to go back to that. That's just it. Nobody could imagine going back to that. And when it became clear to my dad's generation that somebody did actually advocate a return to this mass male manual unemployment, it just finished them off again psychologically. My dad spent his entire life putting himself in a situation where he would never have to go through that, and he goes through it. Unbelievable social betrayal, I would say. I would call it.
And this point you make about the different way we relate to politicians in these circumstances, I think, is really striking when you look back at the 30s, and in some ways the shift has been very positive for the reasons Paul said, in the sense that full employment did become a goal for political parties, and in an age of globalisation, it's important that you protect people from its ravages. But I also wonder whether we've just gone too far. Where there's a real sense that politicians have the levers to pull to shape all of these problems, and I don't think they have. And it really damages politics too, that people will look to the current political class and say, you failed us, and that's partly been exacerbated because politicians have ratcheted up the claims that they can make over protecting people. So, I think it's quite a difficult balance for politicians, and I'm not sure that we've got the right balance at now.
I think also if you're thinking about the 30s as a point of comparison with now, in terms of unemployment and other things, you have to kind of think about which bit of the 30s you're talking about. In the early 30s, the left, particularly in Britain, was very, very weak. In the 31 election, Labour was wiped out with 59 seats, I think. So, by the late 30s, by the time Coming Up for Air came out, the left, had a lot of ideas, had some momentum, did better in the elections later in the 30s. But I think now, in a way, it's more like the early 30s. We're in the early stages of a kind of big capitalist crisis. The left seems quite weak. And that's the kind of point of comparison. Later in the 30s, it's a very frightening time for other reasons, but Keynesianism, those sort of ideas, you could see them getting traction, whether there was going to be a war or not.
Well, I think the other thing is that the 30s, in fact, in lots of ways, were a period of enormous intellectual. They were dreadful, but they were a period around this kind of issue, actually economic and social policy, of enormous, the XYZ Club, the Fabians were really important, all of those post-war plans for regional development, getting women into light industry. these were actually hatched up in about 1936.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
By people being really serious about the policy, really taking the policy, you know, the detail of the policy really seriously. It doesn't, Lisa, you could tell us, but I don't feel that out there's lots of ideas bubbling up. But perhaps there are.
Well, we're right at the end of an administration where it feels stale and bereft. Absolutely not.
I also wonder that a few years ago, Ross McKibben, the historian, wrote a very interesting piece in the London Review of Books about New Labour and about why New Labour didn't seem to have much intellectual kind of content. And he had this argument that it was because the Conservatives had collapsed so massively and so suddenly that it's almost like Labour hadn't really had the time to kind of get their agenda, whereas, you know, Attlee could kind of see Done the 10 coming for years and years and years. And I wonder whether, to some extent, that's happened again with financial capitalism. It's not, of course, it's not collapsed, but most people didn't think that right now, you know, banks were going to be part nationalised, etc., etc. So there's a defeatist air, or a semi-defeatist air, to a lot of the anti-market writing from the last 15 years. There was a sense that one day we will beat this, but it's going to take a long time. And it's happened really quickly. And so everyone's slightly kind of unprepared, and I just wonder whether...
Well, the right is
of course,
I mean, it's not that the right has got a rabbit waiting for the fact that he owns the banks.
But I mean, if we're looking at parallels, I think that we're going through a situation, we're in an early phase of a situation that has quite a lot of parallels to the end of the Edwardian era. If you remember, Keynes wrote... I can't remember where he writes it, but basically in this kind of nostalgic thing about, you know, on the eve of World War I, an Englishman could order the goods of anywhere in the world and they would arrive on his doorstep by ship. And it was a globalised world, which had 20 years, 30 years of rising, two things, rising income and also rising social capital. You know, the labour movement was born, the Salvation Army, whatever you think of all that. It was rising sort of social cohesion. And then, you know, after World War I, a world opens up that is completely sort of the antipathy of that, and nothing goes right for 20 years. But I think we are at a turning point there. Whether or not the current economic downturn bounces back, which is what everybody asks me every 5 minutes, the issue is not that. The old model, the model that drove that full employment, high debt model, is gone. It's gone. So even what comes back will be very different. And I think we haven't yet understood that we're going to be in quite a slow growth world, quite a stagnant world. And the other missing thing is that in the 30s, the real nail in the coffin to economic growth was the fragmentation of the world economy into rival economic blocks. Rival currency blocks, rival trade blocks. You couldn't buy, you know, an English musician or an actor even couldn't work in America, and an American actor or musician, Glenn Miller, had to have all his records covered by English guys from the East End because they weren't allowed by rules to work here. Now that, I think there is a chance of that happening, but it's not going to happen now. It's how the crisis of the states dealing with crisis, if you see what I mean. Does Britain go bust in 3, 4, 5 years' time? Does the American debt go out of control? Does China or Japan? And then they go protectionist. That was what created the world of coming up for air, and all the other Orwell 30s novels actually. It wasn't just a pure cyclical, terrible collapse. It was the fragmentation of the world.